Welcome to the closing plenary, kindly supported by electric paper that colleagues will be familiar with in terms of EVASIS. I'm Steve McAuliffe. I'm the Academic Registrar at the University of Birmingham, but I'm also a trustee of the AUA. I'm delighted to be able to introduce comedian, public speaker, writer, TV and radio broadcaster, Simon Fanshawe, OBE. His substantial expertise in the area of equality and diversity is built on a career as a provocateur with a purpose, bringing a sense of wit and intellect to how we perceive, engage, and shape the world around us. He was a founding member of Stonewall and the Kaleidoscope Trust, supporting LGBT activities activists abroad, and he's no stranger to the university sector, having served also as chair of council at the University of Sussex for 5 years. Simon is co-founder and partner in Diversity by Design, a groundbreaking consultancy that works with organisations to develop diversity solutions to strategic questions in order to build greater performance. We're going to hear from some of the latest research and his consultancy experiences on tackling diversity deficits. Ladies and gentlemen, Simon Fanshawe.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. What a very generous introduction. I can't wait to meet me. No, I sound great. Thanks very much indeed for coming. I'm aware that you had a big dinner last night. You all got absolutely whatevered on the photocopier with people you're not supposed to be photographed next door to. And so well done for keeping awake this late in the day. And so thanks very much for that. I've been asked to talk about diversity in higher education, and I'm going to talk really about how difficult I think it is and how, in a sense, we're failing. But I want to give it some positiveness for you to take away, some positivity for you to take away. Firstly, just to echo some of those things, just so you have some idea of why I might be qualified to talk about this. And I'll talk for about half an hour, and then let's have a debate and have some questions and things. And it's very informal. I mean, I assume, are there feedback forms? Oh, God, I hate feedback forms. I did a conference recently. There was a pile of them. And so I looked to see what somebody had written about me. And somebody had written on the thing, he said, if I only had an hour left to live in my life, I'd want to spend it listening to a speech by Simon Fanshawe. And there was an asterisk at the end, and I turned to the continuation page, and they'd written, because it would seem like eternity. So I very much hope you don't feel like that by the time I've finished. I don't mind people looking at their watches while I'm speaking, but it always annoys me to see them tapping them to see if they're still working. So try and kind of keep awake and keep with it. That would be good. So the universities thing, as Stephen said, I was chairman of Sussex from 2007 to 2013. I was on the council before that. I was also an undergraduate at Sussex, so it was a bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper experience. So my understanding of higher education really does come from that, and then subsequently this very volatile period that we've been going through in education. So I have an idea, at least from the governance perspective, of the kind of pressures that universities are under. I have an understanding of how they work, and I also have some sense of how difficult it is to create change in universities, and I'll talk a bit about that. The second thing is that you mentioned Stonewall. I was one of the founders of Stonewall, and we look at it these days and go, what did we do? Because it's grown into this extraordinary campaign. It was incredibly successful. I mean, if you look at the sort of lobby groups that set up over that period of the 20th century, it is extremely successful. It's one of the most successful. And I think there's two things that are interesting about why it's successful, and none of them are to do with us as individuals. The first thing is that we stumbled on an idea which was about equality. And it was a very simple principle, and we simply said, what we want to do is we want equality. So when we were on the telly or whatever arguing for equal age of consent, people would say to me, well, 16, it's far too young. They were always barking right-wingers, by the way, so that's why I put that voice on. And they'd say, well, it's far too young, 16, a young man hasn't made his mind up by that stage, and so on and so forth. You say, look, the truth of it is, I don't care what the age of consent age is. I don't care if it's 16, 18, 21, 47, 96. I don't care. I just want it to be the same for everybody. Then let's have an argument about the role of the age of consent, the role of legislation in sexual behaviour, and why we want to protect young people. Let's have that debate. And equality really equipped us really well in that debate. And it meant, importantly, the second point, was that it was a concept that meant something to everybody. So the idea that lesbians and gays should be treated equally under the law with everybody else was absolutely fundamentally something that everybody could embrace. Now, if you look at things like bullying, for instance, I mean, my own view now is, and I have said this to Ruth, so I'm not sort of speaking out of turn, but I think Stonewall's too gay now. By which I mean, I don't want to do campaigns against homophobic bullying. I want to do campaigns against bullying. And I want all the parents standing on the school gate, making alliances with each other, saying, actually, whatever the reason is that the kid is being bullied, and I know there are specifics about homophobic bullying, it's difficult to tackle if you're a teacher, because if you tackle racist bullying, no one says you're black. But if you tackle homophobic bullying, Mrs. Aleza. So we know there are particular things that teachers need to equip themselves with, but actually, bullying is the issue, and the way we make progress and embrace those issues is by creating something that means something to everybody. So for me, Stonewall was about creating a platform from which we could make a contribution to a world which we could all live in. And I say all that because that's very important to my perspective and our perspective in the work that we do on diversity. Just as a sideline, there were some fun times in those campaigns. I mean, I remember being on television with an army general, and I'm not frightened of army generals because I was brought up, I'm an army brat, and I lived with these people. And they bark at you, and they're marvelous, and I'm not scared by them at all, but they can be quite intimidating. And this bloke raised, in the debate about gays in the armed forces, he raised the shower defense. I know you remember this. This was that we couldn't have gay men in the armed forces. They didn't talk about women at all, by the way, but you couldn't have gay men in the armed forces because it would mean that the straight soldiers would feel awkward in the showers because they would all be naked together. And I said to this man, you know, the thing about this is, if the thing that frightens you is another guy thinking you've got a cute butt, I'm not sure the army's the right job for you. Because when the Taliban's coming down over the hill, that's frightening, but I really think if somebody thinks you've got a nice ass, I think, you know, really you should go into fashion modeling or something like that. But so there were some fun times in it, but there's an important principle under there. One is this notion of equality, but the second is this idea of the embracing of diversity for everybody. And the reason I think that's important, and it's particularly important, I think, in relation to universities, because of the context in which we are now living, the recent context. And if you look at what's happening around the increasingly protectionist and nationalist agenda that's happening both in the States and here after Brexit, and you can see it emerging in France and other European countries, there is something very particular about the tenor of this. And if you look, for instance, at the Brexit vote, the strongest correlation between those who voted Brexit is between those people, and this is true of every single demographic, if you look, and every single location. If you look at Maury, I think it was Ipsos Mori did the polling, the strongest correlation with those people who voted for Brexit are people who want the return of the death penalty and capital punishment in schools. Now, there are two things, I think, that result from this, or this tells us. One is that actually what these people, it wasn't Europe that they didn't like, it's modern Britain that they don't like. And what that really tells us is that actually these battles around nationalism, America first, out of Europe, the kind of nationalism you see in France at the moment, that kind of inward-looking nationalism is fundamentally a values battle. And for us in universities, it's a values battle. Remember, university staff voted 82% for Remain when polled. It's a values battle around the kind of values that we mean when we talk about diversity. So to some extent, we have taken for granted the idea that the things that we think are important, the advancing of the talents of women who experience barriers in the labor market, the advancing of the talents of BME people who experience barriers in the labor market, the advancing of these equal rights, making people equal, is perceived by some people as a zero-sum game in which they lose, and this is a values battle now, that they regard these values as pushing back on what they perceive as their more traditional values. And the difficulty for universities is that universities think that they embody these values. If you talk to people about what universities are for, then they will talk about the idea of citizenship or civilization in the best sense of the word. They will talk about academic inquiry, empathy, the understanding of other people. There's a whole range of language that people will use in order to talk about why universities are important to society. Clearly, they also talk about contribution to GDP and so on and so forth. But the thing about universities, which you have to remember, is that universities are a minority pursuit. It's a very big minority, but it is a minority pursuit. And so in advancing the cause of why universities are important to society, we have to be more and more and more conscious, not just of widening participation, but the fact that in the region of 60% of the country didn't go to university, and their kids will not go to university. We exist in a particular part of society. So not only have we got the background at the moment of this values battle, which we see ourselves on, quotes, the losing side, so to some extent these values are under pressure, if not under attack. What also happens is that universities themselves are simply not convincingly enough, except with terrific exceptions locally. As a body, I still think that universities are not convincing society that we are worth what we say we're worth. So this is a difficult context in which to argue about diversity. And if you want to look at one other thing that I think brings into sharp relief the position of universities in relation to diversity, it is that universities themselves, not the students, but the staff, are fundamentally not diverse. I sat on a platform and looked out at those Sussex graduands every year for 6 years, and you could see the United Nations, and then you turn round here and you see 50 Shades of Grey. Bless them, wonderful teachers, fabulous people, very talented people, many good friends there. Actually, reasonable balance of ages and so on and so forth, but no balance of real balance of gender when it comes to the professoriate. 20% of the professoriate nationally are women. When it comes to BME academics, you have a far less big chance of becoming a professor if you're a working black academic than you do if you're a working white academic. It's substantially, significantly less, let alone the sheer actual numbers of BME academics that are working in universities. Not then to also to look at the BME attainment gap. If you take either of the two measurements of this, firsts and 2-1s, on an equal tariff, achievement of first and 2-1s, or if you look at the longitudinal study that predicts based on your tariff what degree you will get, there is a 17% gap nationally between BME students and their white friends. We are taking BME students in at tariff X, Y, and Z, and instead of them getting those predicted degrees, we are taking educational value out of their time at university. And yet, as I always say to vice-chancellors, I say, you know, this system is lauded as the best higher education system in the world. It is fantastic. I say to the vice-chancellors, I say, and you're some of the cleverest people in the country. So how come you can't solve this one then? Now, I'm not being horrible about this. I'm just putting out the facts. We are faced with a serious challenge here about what we do about diversity in universities. One of the reasons, one of the things that's useful to think about too, though, is that whilst universities have some stark diversity deficits, so do other areas of industry, public service, and so on and so forth. I was just talking to a health trust in which we're working. I was talking to the head of diversity there. They have 19 senior jobs in this health trust. 3 of them are women. They're all white. And if I tell you that this health trust lives in the middle of the northwest, it's slightly north of here, and you think about the demography of where it's situated, I won't say what the city is, but if you think about what it's likely to be, why is that the case? So it's not just universities. This is a problem that is pandemic across particularly the higher levels of organizations of all different kinds. So let's just think about a few things that might help us to do something about this. It's a kind of what to do thing, really. The first thing, I think, is to think about this question of how do we articulate diversity in such a way that it's not either perceived or is about, quotes, minorities. And when I say minorities, for shorthand, if you don't mind me including women, it stops me having to say women and minorities, but I mean those groups of people that people think are minorities, and they talk about it in those terms. If it's to be something that's not about minorities, but actually is about the whole population of an organization, we have to do that. Our contention would be that the way to do that is to see diversity as something that's in the service of the goals of the organization. So the starting point in a university to talk about diversity is not diversity, it's education and research. So the good question to start with, so we're just doing a fantastic project actually in Nottingham University at the engineering faculty. They're going to expand the engineering faculty by 25%. Is anybody from Nottingham here? Well, they're obviously out there expanding the faculty and doing all the things that need to be done. Fantastically ambitious, fantastically ambitious. So we said to them in the first session with the leadership of the faculty, where's engineering going? And they said, engineering, we want it to be the best engineering department in Britain after Oxbridge and Imperial. We say, fantastic. No, we mean, where's engineering going? And they went, oh. And they started talking about soil and extreme weather and building places you can't normally build and new graphene, down the road, all these kind of things. And we had this fantastic discussion about engineering. One of the really interesting things about that is, of course, that extreme weather doesn't happen in Britain. Britain's weather is actually terribly dull. I mean, it's very changeable, but it's never extreme. It's typically British, isn't it? It's kind of, well, whatever. A bit of rain, bit of sun. But extreme weather is a huge challenge. Water, rain, winds, warming, etc., etc. And we had this fantastic discussion about it. We said, all right, where's the Faculty of Engineering within that? And they started to talk about the various focuses of the different bits of the faculty. And then we started talking about the particular teams that we were involved in. So we were having a question ultimately about the talent they need to equip themselves in order to achieve those really big goals. So what combinations of people and types and identities do they need? So that's one thing that I want you to think about is how do you frame diversity as an answer to the question, what combinations of talent do we need in order to achieve the goals that we've set ourselves? Because that's the way to do it in such a way that then embraces everybody. And yes, actually, if you introduce more talented women, or more talented BME people into the competition for those jobs, there is less opportunity for people who are less talented. But that's always going to be the case if you open up the pipeline. But the point about that is it benefits the goals that you're trying to achieve. So there's a value to it. And of course it's more competitive, but that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. So the second thing I think that's worth talking about is that if you're going to achieve something in diversity, you need to change things. It's the cliche about, it's always ascribed to Einstein, apparently he didn't say it, but there is an absolute obvious truth to the fact that if you continue to do the same thing and expect a different result, then you're not thinking about it hard enough. So what you need to do in order to change the numbers is you need to change the way you're doing things, okay? You actually need to change the way you're doing things. So bless it, LGBT History Week, and my God, I've spoken at thousands of them. It's great to start the conversation, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything. So you've got to think of things that redesign processes and actually change things, and that's the third thing, is the way you redesign things. I'll tell you a story. It's a very famous story about auditioning for orchestras. It was the Boston Symphony Orchestra in the mid-70s. They were auditioning for musicians. And if anybody watches The Voice on television, you'll see an adaptation of it. Anybody does watch The Voice, actually, I caution you, just stop. Dreadful program. But nonetheless, if you do, well, there you go, your brain will rot. But if you watch The Voice, this is an adaptation of this. 1975, Boston Symphony Orchestra recruiting for musicians. They said, we just want to listen to the way people play, and we just want to recruit the best musicians. And when they did that, they kept on recruiting white male musicians. And they couldn't work out what was going on, what was in the gap between our intentions and our outcomes. Something is happening here. So then some bright spark said, well, I tell you what, why don't you put a curtain between you and the people who are playing? So actually, you really can just listen to how they play. And they did. And they started to choose the best musicians that they heard play. And of course, they didn't just choose white men. What's fascinating about this is two things. One is that you need to design the bias out. You can't think it out, you can't awareness it out, you can't educate it out. We are driven towards decisions we don't even want to make. And boy, have I been in some relationships like that. But you're driven towards those decisions, even though you don't want to. So you have to design them out. And the fascinating thing about the research on that thing was that the visual clue of those musicians being white and male resulted in an oral judgment that they played better. So you've got to create a situation where you design things out. And the third thing that's worth thinking about, I mean, and this is the unconscious bias thing. I mean, people talk about unconscious bias at the moment, and if I can say one thing to you, don't do unconscious bias training. It's a very powerful concept, and I've just illustrated it for you. It's a very powerful concept, and it is a very valuable understanding in relation to diversity. But your bias does not, your unconscious bias does not get trained out. And one of the dangers is that there's more and more research to suggest that if you go through unconscious bias training, it confirms your biases. Because people go, oh, you mean everybody's biased? Oh, phew. And then you think, I've been through unconscious bias training, so therefore all my decisions must be absolutely fine now. Wrong. So be very, very cautious of it. Apart from which, it's incredibly expensive. And, you know, I think it's a bit of snake oil myself. But there you go. It's a very important concept, though. And the third thing is what brings about change in the way that we think. And a lot of work in diversity has been based for years and years and years on the idea that you can educate people, you can create awareness in people, and that's what changes the way in which people behave. What I would suggest to you is it's the opposite. What we've learned from the behavioral economists is actually what you do is change the way people behave, and that will change the way that we think. And I'll give you a good example. I was in Derby Station, God knows why, one day, changing trains, and there were these three middle-aged, working-class women behind the counter who ran the cafe, chatting on about a wedding they had been to at the weekend. And they were talking about, you know, the clothes and the flowers and the cake and the fights and the tears in the car park and all. Sorry, the love, the relationship. And they were talking about all the things you talk about at weddings. And it took me about 3 or 4 minutes to realize that they were talking about one of their son's civil partnerships. Now, if 10, 15 years ago you'd said to them, what do you think about gays? I don't know what answer they would have given, but they would have had a kind of thing about, you know, they would have yes or no, I can't be bothered, I don't care, I'm hostile, whatever. They would have had an attitude. But the truth of it was, once you changed their behavior and gave us an institution which every member of the family could be part of and gave that relationship a status in the world, what they thought about lesbians and gays didn't matter. They changed their thinking because they were in a different situation. If you're white and you work with BME colleagues, you work with people, say, from another culture or come from another cultural background, speak in a different kind of way and so on and so forth. If you're really sensitive to what's going on, and likewise, if you're black, I suspect, if you're sensitive both ways, you actually have to make an effort consciously with each other to understand what's going on, to understand a bit about that person, their background, their approach, their attitude, and actually simply being in a position that's different. I'm married to a Nigerian guy. So I'm assuming you're Nigerian, either that or there's a big party that's fancy dress after the session. I'm married to a Nigerian guy, and I'm not stupid enough to say, oh, therefore, you know, I know what it's like being black, because clearly I don't, you know, because I'm not. But, you know, I'd vote for Obama and all that. But 3 times if I could, you know, the classic white liberal position. But the point about it is that I do see the perception of race in Britain every day of my life. That changes how I am about race. And years and years and years of talking or meeting with black friends and talking about race has not had the profound effect that actually being married to somebody who's black has had on my life and the way in which I perceive race in Britain. So what I'm saying is that behavior changes thinking. It's not the other way around. And that's a very important underpinning of how we achieve change in universities. Now, I said that in the blurb, it said I would talk a bit about the research. Well, the interesting thing about that last bit of research, that's very much the stuff that's come out of. It started with that concept of nudge, and it's the kind of thing that says, for instance, if you say to people, we'll fine you £100 if you don't pay your tax, actually it has very little effect on people. But if you say to people, 85% of the people in your road have paid their tax, you're more likely to do it. So there's a whole load of behavioral economics that's looked at the ways in which you can change people's relationship to their circumstances and how you get people to change behavior. And there's reams of research on it, and it's good stuff. Secondly, on the diversity question, it's worth looking at two sort of aspects of this and then thinking about the research that's been done into the back of it. If you think about diversity, we think it's important to think about two concepts in diversity, or two parts of diversity, which they're related, but they need to be focused on separately. The first is the diversity deficits. Now, the diversity deficits are well known. I've referred to a couple in higher education. They're very well known. We worked with a law firm, very, very big law firm, sort of Canary Wharf, thousands and thousands of lawyers. And they have more partners called David than they do women. It's extraordinary. 14% of their partners are called David, and only 11% of their partners are women. So the question they put to us was, well, actually, to be fair to them, they didn't put it like that. They asked us, why have we got so few women partners? And when I counted up, I said, well, it's because more of them are called David than etc. So they've got this statistic, which, of course, has never left the company now. It's mentioned the whole thing, which is fantastic. There are actually, by the way, more people called John, David, and Andrew in the top 289 jobs in the FTSE 100 than there are women and black people. So there you go. It's a good game, this. Try it. Count them up. It's fantastic. But this is a classic example of a deficit. The important thing with the deficits, though, is to understand what's actually happening. Because organizations will have deficits that look quite similar to each other, but actually there will be a nuance about exactly what's happening in the context of the particular organization. So, an example. We did 3 things in that organization. The first thing was we asked all the partners, confidentially to us, but attributed, to nominate 3 partners, 3 great partners. We said, nominate 3 great partners. And the reason I wanted it attributed was I wanted to know who was doing the nominations. Sure enough, all the men nominated themselves. Despite the fact that 11% of the partners were women, only 3% of those nominated as great were women. So you can already see there's a perception of what a great partner is. That's clearly affecting the chances of women. The next thing we did was we looked at people applying to be partners, and you can transfer this idea into your organizations. Got to understand the actual reality of the deficit. What about the pre-partner levels? Equal percentage of men and women applying to be partners. So we did a very brief test. What's the level of ambition between the men and the women? Because essentially that's the difference between a lawyer and a partner. You're a good lawyer by the time you get to that stage. It's actually about whether you want to run the company and expand the business and so on and so forth. The women were less ambitious than the men. Well, there's 2 reasons. There's 2 potential reasons for that. One is women are less ambitious than men. I doubt it. What happened to the ambitious women then? So we went back down and we started to do some exit interviews with women that had left. Turned out that what was happening was, one woman said to me, she said, I want a different, better work-life balance. I said, where are you going to work? She said, I'm going to work at Goldman Sachs. I said, you're lying. And then she told me. Basically, the women were looking up at the top, the ambitious women, and thinking, well, I'm not called David, so I'm for the Ofsky. So in other words, the particular story of that was about what they thought a partner looked like, so there's some bias in up there, but also what was happening to the ambitious women. That was the key thing, because this company was spending a lot of money on taking graduates, training them up, $250,000 a graduate, having them for 3 or 4 years, and then they were going off. They were paying other people's training investment. That's the particular story. It's not always the story. I often wonder, for instance, about, in university terms, if you look at the development of history post-war, you'll see that domestic history, the kind of the history of things, as opposed to the Internet of Things, the history of things, the idea that it was important to understand, what spoons people used, or, what kitchen implements there were, or how people cooked. The idea that that was important to an understanding of history is a relatively recent development, and it was spearheaded, well, it was interestingly spearheaded by Asa Briggs, I think, who then, wrote a series of books, particularly about the Victorians. He was a man, but actually that sphere of history was terrifically pursued by women historians who realized that actually everybody's daily lives told us hugely something about history, about the way in which the world had developed. But it took a long time for that to get status. So there's this thing, I think, about female subjects. I mean, you look at the progression of the study of slavery. It's been incredibly slow to see slavery given the kind of legitimacy that it deserves as an academic study, for instance. So I think there's something around the way in which is akin to that idea of the great partner thing. There's something around the status that we give to particular subjects that I think affects the way in which particular groups of people progress. I mean, you can see, they call it queer studies. I can't bear the phrase queer because it was what was shouted at me when I was young. But that's what the young people talk about, queer studies. But if you look at the legitimacy of queer studies, it's taken a long time, comparatively, for that to be seen as a legitimate area of study. It's quite interesting seeing, I think, the Tate exhibition, the queer art exhibition, sort of 1860, whatever it is, to 1967. I mean, it's really interesting because it's couched entirely in a legitimate aesthetic and critical view about British art. So it's not really, it's about whether there is such a thing as a queer sensibility in relation to art. That is actually quite an interesting question. But I would think 10, 15, 20 years ago, it would have been given the kind of academic credibility that exhibition in a big national gallery gives it. So, and the second thing I want to say, and it was sort of in a sense the last thing, is that it's worth thinking about diversity in two particular ways, as well as the deficits and the dividend. Sorry, I'll talk about the dividend. The deficit I've talked about. The dividend from diversity, there's tons of research. You can find tons and tons of papers. Grant Thornton, Credit Suisse, McKinsey. There's a very good page on McKinsey's site called Diversity Matters. It's got some terrific stuff on it. There's tons and tons of research that proposes a correlation between diversity and high performance. There is actually nothing I've discovered, and I'm trying to get something going in this respect, but there's nothing I've yet discovered that looks specifically at the relationship between diversity and higher education performance. In other words, the performance of an institution or the performance of a particular subject. I can't find anything particular. And funny enough, I've been talking to an academic in Aberdeen about the possibility of Doug Martin, the possibility of seeing if we can find a way of doing this. But there isn't anything specific, so I apologize that I don't know anything, and I've looked and looked and looked. But this general idea, it's a correlation. And what's interesting, I think, about that is if you think about it, that's fairly clear why there would be a correlation. If you're an organization that has bothered to unlock the talent of people who frequently experience blocks to their talent, then you are an organization that is taking the development of talent seriously. And as a professional development organization, that's something that you would understand. You would see that actually if you unlock talent and really bother to unlock talent, then you start to see the flowering of different kinds of people. But the dividend really comes from how you combine those people. We have a very heroic view of what achievement is in Britain, in the world actually, not even in Britain. We have a very heroic view. We've got this idea of, the CEO, these big figures, the vice-chancellor, all these people who are supposed single-handedly to kind of wander in and march in and transform organizations. And the truth of it is they don't. They give leadership, and that's fundamentally important because it sets a tone, it sets aspirations and goals. It's very, very important. But good leaders know they don't do it on their own. Good leaders know that they only do it because people collaborate with them, and then altogether we follow. And then we're leaders in our own bit, and we start to lead that. So there's a kind of collective view of leadership, and we know that. If you think, for instance, I'll give you an analogy which is from football. Now, I should say, before I give this analogy, I don't like and care less about football. My idea, ghastly thing, and, it should be stopped. And my idea of watching football is, you just turn the sound down and watch the legs, because that's aesthetically fun. But the thing is that I don't like football, but we all know, don't we, that the person who puts the ball in the goal is not the only person who scored the goal. There's a process. It happens. If you take rugby, which I'm much more fond of, watch the All Blacks play. No one plays like a star. They all play to their own strengths collectively. They're always there where their colleagues want them. It's quite extraordinary. Somebody passes and they weren't there, and then they are there. And we all know that. We all know that in our work, that's what we do every day of the week. We think, actually, I tell you who I need for this. I need Rob and Sonia. That's who I need, because I need, you know, I'm a great starter. I'm a terrible completer finisher. You know, we did a thing with Google once, and we put them all on a line, and you put them entrepreneurs that end and consolidators that end. And they all went up that end. Just a small group of about 30 of them. They all went up that end. And as they went up that end, there was actually no one at that end. And I heard one of them say to his friend, he said, "That's why we don't get anything done." We all know that. But the systems and processes we use do not enable us to put together teams of people. We don't appoint professors on the basis that they are nurturers of talent and entrepreneurs and impresarios of other people. We do it because they've got a 4-star. We do it because they bring research income. Now, they might incidentally do this, but we don't do it because they do it. We don't make that one of the key things on the basis of which we recruit, and we should do. So the last thought I really want to leave you with, I suppose, is that if we're going to do something serious about diversity in universities, we have to do a number of things. We have to have an appetite for change given the data. The data tell us that we're in a bad way when it comes to diversity, that we're not developing the talent of our staff. So we have to change things. The second thing is we have to make a change in behavior and the way that we do things in order to change the attitudes and not the other way around. And in order to do this, we have to start to recruit and promote in such a way that we do it on the basis of creating teams that together achieve great things. So one thing to take away from this is to stop appointing the person who you think is apparently the best person for the job. Because if you don't interrogate the idea of best, what you'll use is the idea of the person who floated to the top of the pool the last time, or in that particular subject. So the best engineers at the moment will be, in the main, men. Because there are far more men who've been in engineering for a far longer space of time to earn the kind of research credits and get the kind of jobs at the top. So if you go on just scooping the cream of previously skewed ponds, we're now getting to mixed metaphors that are just unbearable, but you get the idea. If you go on, you'll just replicate the basis on which these people got to the top in the first place. So what you need to do is to develop very particular criteria based on what are we trying to do, what's our department's role in these big goals, what are we trying to do there, then what are the explicit criteria? And one of the things that we find, we've just done a wonderful project, or are doing a wonderful project in the Department of the Division of Population Medicine in Cardiff Medical School. Anybody here from Cardiff? Woo! Well, Cardiff's loss is our gain. And it's a fantastic project. They're trying to transform medical research and practice and education to focus it on the health of people in Wales, which is actually always a funny thing when I say that, because you'd think that all those things would be focused on the health of people, but apparently they're not in most places. This is population medicine is a whole new thing, and it's fantastic. And they're doing an amazing job, and we've just worked with them to reframe the way in which they talk about the jobs. Essentially what the job adverts have said is, you've got to be bloody good at this. Now, this is the kind of bloody good at this person we're looking for. We want someone to nurture, we want someone to lead, we want someone to... And they've chosen, they've worked through this matrix and they've chosen different descriptions. So it's about the excellent person. Now let's think about the who we want. There's no trade-off here. You want an excellent person, but it's about the who you want, who brings difference to that team that's going to enable that team to achieve the greatest things it can achieve. So stop applying the best person for the job and start putting together the best teams for the job. Start recognizing the comparative values and talents that people can bring to teams. And importantly, set yourself some realistic targets based on the promotions and recruitments and expansions that you're about to do. Set yourself some real and realistic targets that will start to change the numbers. So that actually you will say, we will actively seek to change the balance of gender in this particular part, because it makes strategic sense. Link it to your strategy, and then look at the why and how you might. What might be the actual numbers that would require? It may be demographic. We're going to change the number of BME people because actually What we might be saying, actually, what we want is in engineering, we want to tackle extreme climates. That involves overseas. We need more international collaborations and partnerships. We need a culturally more diverse organization within engineering because that's what we're trying to do. We might say we're trying to design whole life buildings. What we need in the department the expertise of people who have mobility problems. Because what whole life buildings need is they need an understanding of design which will support people to live in the same place as their mobility declines as we get into an older population. These are all examples of diversity that both offers opportunities to real talent, but also serves the strategic aims of the particular subject of the particular department. So just some thoughts, really, about how you've now got to go back to your universities, of course, and fundamentally change the way they do things. Now, I do realize that is a bit of a tall order. So, I mean, what we try and do is do it in a bite-sized bit. So just the next time you're involved in a recruitment or a promotion process, in whatever phrase, just say to people, let's just take a little bit of time to think about what we're trying to achieve in this team, whether it's in estates or finance or whether you're supporting an academic department or whatever. Let's just think about what we're trying to achieve in this team, even if you do it on your own or with a couple of colleagues. So what are the big goals? What's the strategy of this particular bit of the university? What would describe, when she or he walks through that door, who are they that would bring that difference, that would add something? What do they look like? What's their leadership ability? What class do they come from? All those questions. Just think about that. And if you relate it right back to the beginning of what I said about the way in which universities need to legitimize themselves much more articulately in the bigger world, what they've got to do is somehow represent a springboard for everybody in society. They've got to do things that mean things to everybody's daily lives and in their prosperity. And that, I would suggest, is one way of doing it. You've been very patient. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to ask questions or argue, that would be lovely.
We do have in the region of 10-15 minutes for questions. So if you do have a question, can you raise your hand, please? And we've got a roving mic who will be with you shortly. So
and no one's leaving until somebody asks a question, so we could be here until tomorrow, you know. Or argue, for goodness sake. There's a man in the middle there. A man in the middle. Argue, for goodness sake. That's what universities are about.
He's from Derby as well.
Oh, is he from Derby, is he? Oh, are you from Derby?
He is from Derby, yes. Hi there, Russell Roberts from the University of Derby. Just a quick question, really. You've obviously covered a wide range of different populations, but you've not talked about age. And I'm just interested in the changing demographic, the implications, obviously, of what Brexit might cause us in terms of immigration, and therefore, for me, that puts even more emphasis upon widening the talent pool. But I'm worried about that taking the cream off the top discussion that you meant, and what therefore is, how do we get to those people that haven't been percolating through at that point? So I wondered if you just expand on that bit around age and what you think the impact that might have on this process.
It's an interesting point, and it's good to think about that a bit more. What I think would be wrong to say is that the people who have spent long time and long careers in developing incredible expertise, you know, are to be valued and treasured. So I'm not saying that we don't just do that, but what I am trying to say, I think, is that when you put together groups of people, it's important that we learn how to combine the longevity of their wisdom and what might be brought by other generations of people. So classically, for instance, if you look at, we did some work in GCHQ. GCHQ is fascinating. I mean, I left GCHQ being utterly convinced away from, I mean, I'm perfectly happy actually for GCHQ to monitor my emails. They're not reading my emails. I'm really happy that there's these guys sitting in Cheltenham trying to make us happier and safer. And we used to say to them, actually, just by the by, at the beginning of the sessions, we used to say, if this is not going to help you defeat ISIS and make me safer in my bed at night, could you please go back to work? You know, this has got to be related to your strategic objectives. But they had the other thing too is do ring the GCHQ number. Sorry, I'm off the point. I'll get back to it. Do ring the GCHQ general number. It's on their website, and it's hilarious. If you ring it, you get a message, and it says, "This is welcome to GCHQ." It says, your phone call might be recorded for training purposes. And I said to the director, I really think that's beyond satire. But they've got a very interesting challenge there. And it's particular to age in the sense that often when people talk about living online and kind of, you know, we've gone from digital migrators to digital natives. Now we've got digital dependents, you know. They have got an incredible system that's built up over the years. And it was built up because the original system that had telegrams went through London. So to start with, there was, you know, 3 probably ladies sitting in Whitehall reading everybody's telegrams. And then, of course, there was teleprint and so on and so on and so on. But it all originally came through London. That's why GCHQ is kind of, why it's in Britain as opposed to anywhere else. So they've built this incredible heritage system in their IT. And it needs to be maintained. So they need the people who've been there for that long, who really know how to maintain the thing. At the same time, what is going on now is a generation or 3 different in terms of communication and the way in which terrorism is now organizing itself. I always say ISIS is an app. It's not a movement, it's an app. You log on. You know, these people in Sweden or wherever they do, they log on and then they drive trucks down the road or whatever ghastly things they do. So classically, what they've got to do is find a way within that of combining typically age and youth. So it's the combination that gives them the drive towards innovation. But, by the way, you have to be careful with equating innovation with youth, because that's not necessarily a useful equation. So that would be one thing. The other thing I think is, and taking that idea, is I think that it is possible for those of us who are older, nonetheless, to think about the development of things that we need in order to service. I mean, we're, you know, in 2020, I mean, where are we now? 2017. So, well, so if somebody's 8, if somebody's 10 now, 2025, they're coming to university, aren't they? That's about right. It's 17, 18, that's right. So how do we plan for those digital dependents? Now, that requires people who've got experience, but also to challenge their own experience. So I think the point about age, so that's one bundle of things about age. The other thing about age, I think, is this, is that if you look at the big employment survey in Britain, the least happy workers in the British employment, you know, employed in Britain are men over 50 who are married and don't have a religion. Now, that's if you just do a ridiculous extrapolation from those figures, right? Those are the least happy people at work in Britain. But their answer to their question, by the way, is not to tell them to get God and get a boyfriend. That is not going to solve their problem. What's probably happening there, if you really interrogate the figures, is they've reached a stage in their career where they're probably not going to go any further. Their kids married, assume they have, the kids have left. So they're stuck at a moment in their life where they're saying, well, who am I? I've now got another 40 years or 35 years or something. So one of the answers, I think, to age is to start organizations being able to offer opportunities across organizations rather than just up them. So as the workforce gets older, you need to have much more agility. And what that's about is about describing the jobs that they could go into, not by the previous characteristics, but by really looking at what combination of skills and attributes you really want. So you create something like, you know, the Derby leader or the Derby manager, which actually means that somebody in estates can actually go and move to a management job somewhere else, which produces a whole new challenge. Are those useful thoughts?
Very useful.
Hurrah.
It actually does tie in with lots of things that we're currently doing. We're doing some work as well on BME, which chimes in with the work that you've been describing there with a consortium of other universities. And actually, some of the challenges that you're picking out, not only do they go, you know, you talked about the attainment gap in terms of the first and 2-1s, actually there's also the gaps elsewhere in terms of very much in subject focus, and there's recruitment gaps, all sorts of things. It's really difficult to kind of get into.
And the other really interesting thing, which I should have said a bit more about with the BME attainment gap, of course, is that everybody who under-attains is not BME, and all BME students don't under-attain. So what is absolutely imperative is that you go back to that original idea that this diversity lens, in this particular case a lens on ethnicity, is a prism through which you look at the idea of individual support for all students, but you have that understanding in the back of your mind that it might be particular to ethnicity. Questions? Other questions? Thoughts? Hi in the front here. Bye-bye. Oh, she's switched off already. No, it's lovely, and I'm just trying to be nice, really, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to draw attention to you that much. Hello.
Hello. My name is Donna Pierce-Fennell. I'm from the University of St. Andrews. In your discussion about the recruitment, how would you see mitigating the ability of a group of people to look at somebody and look at a list of descriptions when you're doing a job description, and saying the person that we want looks like this, and not have them look like that paradigm of all white men?
Yeah. You have to be very disciplined in that progression from what are we trying to do, what's the diversity of the department. So we've got a matrix which looks at who and how, and the who, the identity questions, are the sort of classic protected characteristics plus class. And we use, actually, it's an interesting discussion, just a little moment on class there, is that we use the Office of National Statistics metric. There's a very good piece which the LSE did called the class ceiling. See what they did there? It's clever. And they used the ONS metric, and it's this. It's what was the occupation of your parents when you were 14? It's a fun conversation to have, by the way, amongst colleagues, because actually it tells you quite a lot about people's stories. So it's kind of interesting too. So we use those characteristics, and then underneath that, we use characteristics to do with leadership or and detail, global and national, so on and so forth. So more Myers-Briggs, Ebelbini type stuff. So if you really are disciplined in going through that discussion, what you do is you outline, so we had an East Asian Studies department in a big university, and what they came up was 5. They went through that process, and they discovered that the East Asian Studies of this particular university department was actually run by 50-year-old white men. And, you know, this is not unusual. Very good 50-year-old white men, by the way, extremely good. And they recognized that they wanted to change the gender balance, and they needed more of a cultural input because they needed that inside in order to have the kind of depth and texture of what they wanted to do in relation to Japan, Korea, and China. So the 5 characteristics were, the 5 criteria were ability to contribute critically to the department, teach and research in one of East Asian languages, put together collaborative research projects, advocate the department nationally and internationally, and have an understanding of women in East Asia. Did 2 things. One is it was very clear in the ad who they were looking for, but it was strategic, this. It wasn't like, oh, we need more women. There was a strategic reason for this. And it also altered the search. It meant they went and they targeted East Asian women who'd moved out of East Asia, actually, because that was one of the things. So then, what happened, though, was interesting. We only got halfway through the pilot. So what they did was, they had, the shortlist was 3 East Asian women and 3 white blokes. They appointed one of the white blokes. And the reason was, they said, oh, we had a better research track record. And we went, where were those on the criteria? So it's about being really rigorous in this. And the second thing is, there's a method that we use, which is, I mean, there's a wonderful researcher called Iris Bonnet, B-O-H-N-E-T. She wrote a book called What Works? Diversity by Design. I commend it to you. It's a fantastically good book. And she talks about joint selection. So what you do is you look at job applications. You don't look at CVs. You ask for evidence against those criteria, and then you read them like a primary school maths tutor. So you read all the answers to question 1, all the answers to question 2, and we've got a bit of software now which manipulates the order and so on and so forth. So that's how you do it. You take people, get people to look at the evidence rather than the person.
Much change in the way they have to think about how these kind of job applications are reviewed.
Yes, and the thing about it is, it sounds like it's a heavy process. What we find is actually that conversation is incredibly rich in the department, because it's not a conversation people have enough. So if you say to heads of department, what are your goals? What's your plan? What's your strategy for the next 10 years? You kind of say, well, we're applying to the university for 4 extra jobs. You go, well, no, hang on. Let's talk about soil or whatever. Yeah?
Thank you.
If anybody wants to know more about this, by the way, do just email me and I'll send you, there's a reading list and stuff like that that we put together for people.
We've got time for one more question.
One more. You told me I give very long answers. I'm just chatting on. People are leaving. They're going back to far-flung places. Hello.
I'm Sonia Verdi from the University of Essex. And I just want to pursue a little bit what you were saying about the attainment gap and what universities really should be doing about this, how we should be thinking about this, because I was very struck by what you were saying in the emerging literature around behavior influencing the way in which we think, and what you were saying about unconscious bias. And clearly some of the things that we're doing are going to eliminate some of that unconscious bias, such as the anonymization of marking and that sort of thing, but it seems incredibly blunt and not really far-reaching enough. So I'm just wondering, what would your advice or thoughts be in relation to that?
The thing about this whole issue is that, many people, I mean, I've been going, people like me have been going on about it for a bit. There are other far more distinguished people who have been going on about it for a long time. It has taken forever to get the HE sector to admit that this is true in every single institution in the country. So there's been an awful lot of very good effort to articulate the data, just to say to people, will you just face it? Because people, academics are like, oh, well, I want more data. Well, that is the data, so shut up and deal with it. So the consequence of that, I think, slightly has been that actually there's a great divergence of view about what the answer is. There is no settled view, I think, at the moment about what the key differences are. However, there are some. People have talked quite a lot about questions of expectation, that both from their friends and peers and also from themselves, there is quite often a lowering of expectation by BME students. And that is supported, if one can put it that way, around that by a culture of low expectation from tutors. There's a kind of, well, you did very well to get here kind of view. You come from a poor background. That, by the way, also happens to working class kids. Oh, you've done terribly well. So one of the things I think we've got to do is we've got to really ensure that universities are factories to make people's dreams come true at every level, and that we always talk about aspiration. We always talk about shooting the moon. So that's one thing, and it's about getting teachers and tutors to really kind of understand that and inspire them to understand that. And part of that is understanding that there's a problem. So I think that's one thing. The second thing, I think, is a really interesting look at the curriculum, and I don't mean the sort of, I think, rather specious debates about decolonization of the curriculum or whatever, but a much more practical look about actually how can you diversify the curriculum. I'll give you an example. Glasgow School of Art, we did some work in. Now, Glasgow School of Art is tiny, comparatively. It's got a very small staff group and it's very stable. So actually the turnover, to try and diversify the staff group, was actually going to be, it's going to take forever. But they've got a very large group of associate tutors. So the thought they had out of discussions was that we said to them, well, look, what about this? Why doesn't everybody have a goal that says, by the end of the year, we will have diversified the content that the associate tutors will inject into the curriculum? And this was inspired by one particular academic who doesn't work at the Courtauld any longer, but a black academic who works on the Renaissance. And she said to us, don't think that I'm diversity in this respect. Because I may be black, but actually I teach European Renaissance. If you really want to diversify the content of the curriculum, what you need is an Islamic scholar who talks about the Renaissance. You need an Eastern view. So people set themselves a very simple goal. They did two things. They amalgamated all the associate tutors. So the idea was to choose from a range. And the idea was that the list of associate tutors that you produced at the end of the year should be more diverse than the one was at the beginning, and so should the content. And it was a very fruitful debate. So I think part of it is to challenge people to talk to the kids who are learning and ask them what they think about how the curriculum might be enriched by their insights, the kind of things they'd like to see and talk about, and then make that part of the academic debate about what the curriculum should be. So that would be my second thing, would be to talk about it. And the third thing is to find a way of people talking about this in which they're not defensive. It's neither helpful for white people to be racist or either overtly or covertly, nor, I think, in the debate is it particularly helpful for black people to say that white people have no contribution. What you have to do is try and find a way in which there is a realistic dialogue, recognizing power imbalances, cultural imbalances, the way in which the curriculum's organized, who has the power. It's important to understand all that, but try and create a respectful debate in which you're trying to say, look, we've actually got an issue here. It affects a broad range of people. One part of that range are BME people, but it's a broad range of people who are underachieving. How can we support all of them and also make a very particular aspect of this? So I would say those are sort of three things that you might think about. Is that helpful?
Yes, yeah, really interesting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Okay.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'd just like to ask everyone to thank you in the normal way for your... Thank you. Thank you.